story continues with Moses and his brother Aaron standing before Pharaoh, demanding the freedom of the Israelites, God's chosen people, who had endured centuries of brutal slavery in Egypt. Pharaoh, who viewed himself as an invincible ruler, denied the request. His heart was hardened, and he was not ready to let go of the people he considered his labor force. Little did he know, his refusal would bring down upon his kingdom a series of powerful events that would change everything: the 10 plagues. The first of these plagues was a terrifying transformation of the Nile River, Egypt's lifeline, into blood. The once life-giving water turned crimson, killing the fish and causing a stench that spread throughout the land. The Egyptians were forced to dig for water, as the Nile had become undrinkable. But Pharaoh was unmoved. His magicians could perform similar tricks, and he refused to bow to the God of Israel. Next, God commanded Moses and Aaron to bring forth frogs from the river. Frogs swarmed into every home, palace, and even Pharaoh's own bed. Growing desperate, Pharaoh begged Moses to make the frogs go away, promising to release the Israelites. Moses prayed, and the frogs died, leaving piles of rotting carcasses across Egypt. Yet when the worst was over, Pharaoh broke his promise. His pride was greater than his word. The third plague followed. Dust turned into lice, covering every person and animal in Egypt. This time, Pharaoh's magicians were powerless. They could not replicate the miracle. They acknowledged that this was indeed the finger of God. Despite this, Pharaoh refused to listen to his advisors or Moses. His heart remained hardened as he continued to defy the divine command. Then came the fourth plague, swarms of flies that filled the air, invading homes and covering the land. This time, God made a distinction. The area where the Israelites lived was spared. Despite the unbearable discomfort brought upon his people, Pharaoh remained defiant. God's intent was not merely to punish, but to show his power and protect his people, highlighting the difference between those who were chosen and those who resisted his will. The fifth plague struck at Egypt's wealth and sustenance, their livestock. Horses, cattle, donkeys, and sheep fell dead in large numbers. The plague affected only Egyptian livestock, sparing that of the Israelites. Yet still, Pharaoh did not relent. His stubbornness was destroying his kingdom, but he refused to bend to Moses' God. The sixth plague brought boils and blisters upon every Egyptian, afflicting both man and beast. Pharaoh's magicians, stricken with boils themselves, could do nothing. Their power had proven useless against the true power of the God of Israel, but Pharaoh remained unyielding. Then God sent the seventh plague, a devastating hailstorm. The sky unleashed hail and fire upon the land, destroying crops and killing anyone and anything caught outside. It was unlike anything Egypt had ever experienced. Some Egyptians heeded Moses' warning and took shelter, but many did not. Pharaoh yet again promised to release the Israelites if the hail stopped. Moses prayed and the storm ceased, but Pharaoh's heart grew even harder and he broke his promise once more. The eighth plague brought locusts, swarms that devoured every green plant in Egypt, leaving behind barren fields and orchards. Pharaoh began to see the destruction his defiance was causing, but his pride still prevented him from setting the Israelites free. Egypt was brought to the brink of ruin, but Pharaoh's stubbornness endured. Then came the ninth plague, a thick, impenetrable darkness that covered Egypt for 3 days. The darkness was so profound that people could not see one another or move about. Yet, in the homes of the Israelites there was light. Pharaoh, now fearful, offered a compromise, but it was insufficient. Moses demanded total freedom for all the Israelites, and Pharaoh refused. The final plague was the most devastating of all, the death of the firstborn. God sent the angel of death through Egypt, taking the lives of every firstborn, from the firstborn of Pharaoh to that of the lowliest servant. The cries of grief and despair echoed throughout Egypt, yet the Israelites were spared. They had followed God's instructions to sacrifice a lamb and mark their doorposts with its blood, and the angel of death passed over their homes. This event would become known as Passover, a reminder of God's deliverance. It was this final blow that broke Pharaoh's will. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the dead of night and ordered them to take the Israelites and leave Egypt at once. After 430 years of slavery, the descendants of Abraham were finally free. Led by Moses and Aaron, they began their journey toward the Promised Land, a journey fraught with trials, but filled with hope. The Israelites left Egypt in haste, carrying all they could, but Pharaoh's change of heart was short-lived. He rallied his army and set out in pursuit of the Hebrews. As the Israelites reached the Red Sea, fear and doubt began to spread among them. They felt trapped, with the sea before them, and Pharaoh's army closing in behind. But Moses, with unbroken faith, raised his staff as God commanded. The waters of the Red Sea parted, creating a path of dry land for the Israelites to cross. Pharaoh's army in its arrogance followed. But once the Israelites had safely crossed, Moses stretched out his hand again, and the waters returned, drowning Pharaoh's chariots and soldiers. The mighty Egyptian army was no more. The people of Israel were saved, and they sang songs of praise to God, who had delivered them from the hand of their oppressors. Their journey was far from over. The desert presented its own challenges: hunger, thirst, and the temptation to return to the familiarity of their former lives, even if it meant slavery. But God provided for them. He sent manna from heaven to feed them, caused water to flow from a rock, and brought quails to satisfy their hunger. Despite their hardships, God remained faithful to his promise. The Israelites eventually arrived at Mount Sinai, where God called Moses to the mountaintop. There, Moses received the 10 Commandments, laws that would form the foundation of the Israelite community and their relationship with God. These commandments emphasized the importance of worshiping only the one true God, honoring parents, and living with integrity and justice. They were not just rules. They were a covenant between God and his people, defining their identity and purpose. While Moses was on the mountain, the people below grew restless. In their impatience, they asked Aaron to create an idol, a golden calf, to worship. When Moses descended and saw their betrayal, he was filled with anger. He shattered the stone tablets and destroyed the idol. The people were punished for their disobedience, and Moses returned to the mountain to receive the commandments once again. This act of renewal symbolized God's willingness to forgive and his desire to continue the journey with his people. The story of Moses, the 10 plagues, and the 10 commandments is one of faith, resilience, and transformation. It shows the power of God to bring justice, the importance of perseverance in the face of adversity, and the strength found in a leader who trusts fully in his divine mission. Moses' journey from the palaces of Egypt to the desert wilderness and beyond was one of incredible faith and purpose. The plagues were not just acts of punishment, but also demonstrations of God's power and his protection of his people. The 10 Commandments offered a path forward, a set of guiding principles for living a righteous and meaningful life. Moses led his people not only out of physical bondage, but also toward spiritual freedom, teaching them to live in accordance with God's will.